Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of 2023. This is the ReNouned podcast, and we are your co-hosts, Alison Hager
and Mark Schulz.
As a reminder, ReNouned is a podcast for the curious. We dust off the commonplace to look for new relevance as we challenge ourselves to think critically about the objects that surround us, how they echo our past, reflect the present, or foreshadow the future. So, Mark, why don't we jump right in?
Yes,
what was
let's
our noun for today?
Absolutely. Our noun was or is writer. W-R-I-T-E-R, writer. I'm doing that spelling bee thing again.
I love the spelling bee thing. I love it. And you never know.
I love it.
It's
and
always
excited.
good to clarify.
Back in the saddle, 2023. It's going to be good. So,
yeah. And a quick note, I know we've been on a bit of a hiatus, so thank you everyone for your patience. Of course, we had the holidays. And as Mark mentioned in our holiday Happy New Year message, I was traveling for a while and Mark is a new pet owner. So we were a little busy. And then unfortunately, I got ill. I am fine now, but I had a lingering cough that kind of, meant that we couldn't record for a while. So thank you for your patience. But February, we are back in the saddle. So Mark, shall we roll our die and see who kicks off?
Absolutely. Oh, I have a 6
and a 1.
Ooh,
all right.
Polar opposites.
So Mark is taking us away.
All right. Cool. If you can give me my 15 seconds on the clock, I'm going to set up for when we do yours. All right. Perfect.
All right. So ready and go.
A writer is one who writes, and the act of writing, of leaving a record of a thought of someone's existence, comes to life perhaps most controversially when that writer is a graffiti artist.
Ooh, and you had like 1 second left. That's so interesting. We definitely did not go the same direction, and I'm really, really intrigued by this. And I think, as we briefly mentioned when we got this noun, this one was so broad that we were wondering kind of where we'd go. That's fantastic. Okay.
Excellent. All right. 15 seconds on the clock for you instead, and hit it.
So for today's episode, I've basically written a love letter.
9 seconds left.
That's
wow. Interesting take. Certainly creative. Excited.
And very vague. Okay. And very vague. I guess I'm sure it gives you no idea what I'm actually going to be talking about.
Oh. That's how much time you had left.
Fantastic. All right, Mark, bring us into this fascinating world.
Yes, of course. Okay. So as always, I started going down my rabbit hole by basing, for me, where's this word come from, especially with something like writer, which I think you're going to see is why I ended up going where I did. So one who writes -er. And it dawned on me, it's funny, right? We had a problem with gerund, right? When in the history of this, why am I blanking on the word? Shopping. And when we, tussled with that and decided, all right, we're probably not going to do, gerunds anymore, but maybe whatever. Coming into this, I realized, well, here we are with what's called, and I did not know this before looking it up, an agentive noun, or an agent noun, probably pronounced agentive perhaps, but an agent noun, something that takes that ER suffix that we have in English and creates a noun from right. So that's not entirely different than taking one and having an ing. So I don't know, that crossed my mind as something interesting, but I do think it shows how action oriented our language is, and understandably so, I think, as language was evolving. So a little nerd segue there, but okay. So digging a little further into that, nominalization is the use of a non-noun as a noun. So sometimes this is done just with, an inflection change for us, but sometimes it's what they called a morphological change. For example, that gerund ending that we were just talking about, or this agentive or agentive ER, it creates a morph. Hungarian uses the present tense form of a conjugation, for example, and Kazi, a language spoken largely in the state of India, uses prefixes, right? So it's not always this ER, right? A suffix, something like kazi actually can use a prefix to do sort of the same morphological thing, which I thought was kind of cool. The words for write in most Indo-European languages originally meant carve or scratch or cut. And that becomes relevant for what I'm going to talk about a little bit later with graffiti, because you also have things in Greek like graphene, or in Latin, it's scribere, but the Italian form of that, which is very related to the Greek, becomes the foundation for kind of where I decided to head. So where I found my direction was digging a little bit more into that and using the Oxford English Dictionary. I think we both coming into this, you mentioned it's such a broad term. Where are we going to sort of hook ourselves in and find a direction? And when I came to the long list of writer and definitions and so on, the slang originally in the US is a person who writes or paints graffiti, is a writer, and as a form of street art or graffiti artist, often modifying the word, indicating where the graffiti is written by actually, saying it's a subway writer or it's a train writer. And that, I think, is something that we don't hear so much anymore in popular culture. But in the 70s, late 60s and 70s, when this became an American thing, you started to have those distinctions of the writers, which now I think we would think of as like a tag artist or a graffiti artist or something like that. Mm. So, yeah, that for me is a little bit of a hot button issue that I can see in a couple ways. I think Alison, probably knowing me well enough, might have already felt that coming. And so that's, I think, why I was attracted to digging into it a little bit more, because I wanted to sort of explore and challenge myself on what I know about it. And if I can do a little bit more critical thinking about it than I have in the past. So starting, as I often do, with some trivia to get our juices flowing here and our brains going. So audience, please play along as I ask Alison this question. So the first instances of graffiti were recorded, A, by prisoners of war in the 1700s, B, in Rome and Pompeii in the 1st century, or C, in China during the Han Dynasty.
I feel like everything starts in China, but I'm going to go with Pompeii only because I've been there and so many things I saw there. I was like, things don't change. All this stuff that we do, they did. So what is the answer?
You're absolutely right. Yes.
Yes.
Yep. Rome and Pompeii was the first, the recorded of it.
Right.
Been around, but yeah, that's excellent. And what's interesting is the term graffiti, as I just mentioned before, talking about the background, is an Italian word itself. So makes sense that Rome and Pompeii would be, some of the first places that it's recorded. The term graffiti, the word itself, I think we may not realize this. As someone who has studied Italian over the last few years, it jumped out at me right away. That is a plural. Et, ending in an I, is a plural ending for a noun. So it's a plural of the word graffito, which is the past tense of the verb graffiare, which is to scratch. So that background is like to scratch or to sort of scribble. And I just love that, again, because it connects us to our history. If you're going all the way back, right, we were probably first scratching. So many things I read on graffiti brings up, as a historical foundation, cavemen, of course, cave women being like scratching, leaving their mark literally, or trying to capture something on cave walls. So that impulse in our nature has carried through, but become quite a controversial and sort of hot button topic in many ways. So why is it a hot button topic? I think the obvious thing for anyone is although, I say obvious, but in our age demographic, Alison, we may be thinking of it where it was more of a hated sort of thing. Part of what my story and what I got into and was reminded of in my research was that it has really transitioned into mainstream. And I'll talk a little bit about why in a second, but it's not, I would think kids that are born since year 2000, graffiti is not such a transgression, I would bet. And it's seen in designs in pop culture. It's seen as high art in sometimes. It's seen in NFT stylings now with like the very latest in blockchain type of stuff. So I think it'd be very different than, say, us growing up and what we inherited as a way of viewing it from our parents, et cetera, I think would be very different.
Can I tell you a quick funny story that ties into what you're saying, just in terms of people's maybe of different ages, their experiences? So a number of years ago, I'm going to say 5, I'm not sure that's exactly right, I took a trip to Greece with some friends who you know, Mark, and I was in charge of the Athens portion of the trip of finding the Airbnb for us. So I had found this apartment, and we'd spent some time out on Santorini, and then we flew back to Athens, and we took the subway into the city, or the train to the city, and then took the subway to the neighborhood that we were staying in. And then we had to walk, let's say 10 blocks to the apartment. And as we're getting closer to the apartment, there was just more and more graffiti. Like, we're in a neighborhood, we're not in like a touristy area, right? And there's more and more graffiti. And I can feel the stress from my travel buddies, right? For other people. I can just feel it. And I'm thinking, oh, they're hating me right now for picking this place. And they're thinking this is unsafe. Like, I don't know if it's safe or not either, but like, I am gonna, right? Walking like I mean it. And we turn the corner, and the door to the apartment building is literally just covered in graffiti. And I'm thinking, right. And so we go in, and older gentleman meets us and shows us the apartment. It is stunning. It's right across the street from the archaeology museum. It is this incredibly beautiful apartment, and the neighborhood was perfectly fine and safe. But it was just a thing. It's a thing that in Athens, I guess, has really exploded. And we found out a couple of days later, going to the coffee shop, which was just downstairs and around the corner, I walked out, and there were some kids graffitiing the wall in broad daylight. And we found out, I was talking to the owner, they actually, like, businesses will pay kids to do it, to like create art. So to your point, there's been maybe sort of a change, at least in some cultures, about how it's viewed.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that. And it echoes things that I saw differentiating and contrasting European use of it, and how it's sort of propagated and become part of the culture more than here, and how it's viewed. That's fascinating. Perfect. I'm glad you shared that. I'm really glad you shared that. So yeah, I mean, exactly on that note, rather than illicit vandalism and seen as a defacement, some others see it exactly as you just described by some of those owners, as an artistic expression of those who really have no other voice, or those who lack adequate representation in other public channels, or ways to channel energy and perhaps boredom, or, you know, for those that lack the means to do other things. Honestly, if you don't have money in your pocket to go do other activities, I think it can be very different experience. And so you gravitate towards the outdoors, and to sort of leaving your mark, kind of literally on things. Mm-hmm. In doing this research, I tried to put a little mirror up to myself and shake myself out of, you know, I think you start to just ascribe your own reality and your own level of day-to-day comfort to everyone else in an easy way. And that's, I think, a little bit of a trap, because the way that I can view graffiti and how I spend my time, I have the very lucky leisure to spend money to do kind of anything I want. Right. And so there isn't that lack of private space. I live alone, right? There isn't a lack of being able to go do something that would be expressive, or to pay to spend time doing something where the tools you need to do it are very expensive. You know what I mean? You know, I buy an iPad to do cartooning, rather, you know, those that don't have that option. I can see back in the 60s and 70s in the US, this, you know, explains some of the background. I believe it was in Philadelphia or that area, but spread quickly through inner cities. It started with really any paint and permanent markers, right? And then spray paint became a thing, and it sort of evolved into other types of media, but still has stayed, you know, kind of true to that very inexpensive. You could almost find it around at junkyards, you know, like that kind of stuff. Yeah. So with that being said, although I have opened myself up to it, I do, if I'm bringing my opinion into it as we go through this, and I struggle with whether or not to do that. I know our big questions are about that, but I do want to start out with why I do hate it. Like, I hate it when and what's interesting is I think I hate it when it is what it truly is supposed to be, which is like this rebellious, transgressive act that is illegal, versus where it's grown into popular culture and been celebrated. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But for example, in my neighborhood, coming out of, you know, now coming out of COVID, having things be much more normal from what they were, I see signs in the city of when no one was around as much. And I see that graffiti has permeated. It's sort of like invaded, and it almost feels a little like, if I'm not overreacting, it's a little of, we carve out this safe space, so to speak, if it's safe. Like I don't want to make it polarizing, right? But it feels like there's this element of, is it safety? Is it crime? Is because the crime did rise in the city and et cetera. And it feels like it just encroaches because there are massive tags in my neighborhood that were never there before, and no one's taking them down. And I almost feel like that's a reason why I kind of hate it. I was like, I hate the fact that it happened, but I also hate the fact that no one's taking it down. Like, why are you not cleaning your building? Like that kind of thing.
I think this is interesting, Mark. And I know this is what you're questioning yourself on. So this isn't a criticism, but it's really interesting to me because the other way to view it, of course, which you're touching on is, where does this come from? This kind of fear? Because in a lot of cases, like these are kids. I mean, think about having nothing to do during COVID, being a teenager in the city, like losing your mind, especially if you're from a low resource environment, you're going out to tag. It doesn't mean that you are a threat, and it doesn't mean that you are like a danger to others. And then, that is the way a lot of minds go. So it is, I think it's really a relevant thing you're talking about. And I applaud you for like kind of questioning yourself on it.
Yeah. Because I do sit right on the fence of it, because I realize that I might be seeing it in a way that's a little antiquated, a little not backed up with some data, but there's other data back when I was a psych minor in college that did explore the idea of a drop in crime rates in certain cities when things like broken windows were immediately fixed, when the city spent time immediately fixing transgressive things that happened, so that the space that was being carved out didn't welcome further acts of transgression and crime. Does that make sense? Like if something gets broken, fix it. If something's tagged, fix it. So
I think the classic example is actually the subways in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And how cars would be completely graffitied and then they would paint them over every day. And then I think that is the classic example of what you're talking about. But
anyone hearing this who might know if that research has been updated, we'd love to hear from you on social media or through our website, just because that was what I studied, 20 something years ago in college. I think probably research has been done that has challenged that it, to your point, it can be a lot more innocuous. And some people view it, we're going to get into this a little bit, as a positive thing. I think why those owners was it Italy you mentioned?
It was in Athens, in Greece.
In Greece, might have been welcoming it is because is it like legalizing certain drugs? It's sort of accepting it and therefore taking that transgressive act away, but still leaving it as an expression.
Right.
I think
and celebrating the beautiful part of it, like celebrating it as art, adding that, like flipping the lens a little bit.
Right. Yes. I still struggle with that
because I see it.
Yeah. All right. Well, to keep going, sorry, audience, get back to my rabbit hole here, but I think all relevant and things that, bleed through to our big questions later for sure. So a lot of the research that was done before what I was particularly looking at framed this act as like an unsanctioned communication, often practiced by young people. Just that sounds very stodgy. Sure. Probably was. And that, I think, has been the classic way of looking at it. The research that I was looking at, they try to challenge themselves and dig into a deeper story behind it. So there was this research conducted in the Portuguese capital of Lisbon between the years of 2004 and 2007. And so what I was reading, one of the sources that I read in the past few weeks was this study to look into it. So they came out of it saying it's a discursive device forged in the context of symbolic struggles related to a field of visibility. So not just bored teens, but teens in our culture, which is becoming more and more visually expressive in media, in promotion and advertising, in technology, in the permeation of visual things in terms of, I mean, if you think back in human history, right? Movies are not that old. TV is not that old. Therefore, music videos are not that old. Ads online, like we see so much more stuff, to be honest, than I think human history has in the past. And so part of what they're saying is that this idea of the visual, of being seen and how you represent yourself in certain spaces, gets much more amped up and embraced by younger people who literally are looking for a way to be seen, but also like this discursive device, something that wants to start a discourse, that wants to somehow say something. So that, I think, starts to lend itself a bit more integrity. I think where you're probably, your streak, Alison, as I sense, being like, what is it about why they need to do it? What is it about, right, the human desire? People don't often do transgressive things unless there's sort of a need to, or an important drive. So that aesthetic drive, we think, that imperative is sort of driving the youth to do it. So for consideration, the authors, attribute the success of graffiti as an expressive form because of two trends, right? That heightened aestheticization of our day-to-day. So not just the visual that I talked about, but that things need to have a certain aesthetic. They're almost branded. We even have that slang term right now, that's so on brand, or you're being on brand, right? We're sort of and in just doing that, you're embracing marketing, right? And the influence of promotions and advertisements in the world, and the use of what is externally sort of used to represent you. Okay. One little quote here from something, a direct quote says, studies focusing on youth and urban space suggest that, quote, the space of the street is often the only autonomous space that young people are able to carve out for themselves. So I mentioned before, right, when I was thinking of my own day-to-day, I live alone. There are instances where somebody can't be on their own. And they also can't have their own place to express themselves. So this becomes that for many. So hanging around, larking about on the streets and parks and shopping malls. I don't know if shopping malls is so relevant.
This is sounding very West Side Story to me.
Right. Is one form of youth resistance, conscious and unconscious, to adult power. Okay. So graffiti has also become ingrained as an extension of the musical style, but also the lifestyle of hip hop. And I didn't quite know it was as formal as this. So just to mention, in the 1980s, certainly when graffiti, I think, right, the subways you mentioned, Alison, sort of the height of graffiti culture, I think, hitting the mainstream and being seen as such a issue in New York. Hip hop had four pillars: mix mastering, which is basically, right, the production and the mastering of music and samples and things like that. An MC, which would be largely the person rapping or singing or being the talent, so to speak. But graffiti and breakdancing, these are four pillars that I didn't realize were so part of hip hop. So that doesn't surprise me then that it wasn't like the 1980s where, because of a massive rise in crime, it was built into a hip hop style that was exploding. And if it was a formal part of it, then I can see that its proliferation would be so much more explained to me, right? Like just the fact that I read that a couple of days ago was like, oh, that to me makes more sense why it was suddenly everywhere, right? Because, kids especially are just going to take on, they're still doing it. Anything that is linked to a band or a movement, or the other people or the other kids their age are doing, and it becomes something to rally behind that's different, of course. However, the act of leaving a mark on architecture or other structures, right, in the public sphere, sort of hardly started with rebellious youth. In the 60s, historians have found, Victorian practices were all about visiting tourist locations and etching something, their name or initials into these pieces. And so even when I've been traveling in certain areas of the world where I'll be incensed that somebody carved initials into something that now we have such reverence for, I'm like, what? It was somewhere in England when I was viewing the Magna Carta, and there were graffiti, right, etchings from soldiers, I think in the 1700s, that just like left, on things that now are important to us. That's crazy. Anyway, but also areas, where the Vikings raided and plundered, they did the same thing. But it isn't just European. Remains from ancient Mesoamerican civilizations also have these ancient civilizations had the same types of things happening. So there appears to be this human need to leave a mark, something behind as a signifier, either that they were there or perhaps they were saying this is an important space. I want to mark it. I want to make it better. It might not be only about remembering that they were there. I think it's interesting. So trivia number 2, true or false? There is a federal law prohibiting graffiti on city buildings.
False.
It's false. There is only a federal law prohibiting vandalism of railroads. And
interesting.
From what I was seeing, it's more safety related to prevent trespassing. So when I read safety related, either for the person trespassing who might be out there who might get killed because necessarily they could derail a train, but like more often they're just going to get killed. But yeah, apparently that is the only federal thing, which I guess kind of makes sense. I want to go back and find out when that was written, because I'm picturing like, is it railroads from back, steam? But right. No, I don't think we were doing any vandalism at the time. I don't know. So there is a distinction being made now between traditional graffiti and street art. I think, Alison, you and I have been sort of hitting on it. The differences, not only in how to view it, but also how it's proliferated and become quote unquote popular. So more and more graffiti is being accepted in many circles as an acceptable aesthetic, and thereby entering into the realm of street art and elevated art. I actually read there's a lot of debate still, though, that even when that happens, it can be white, male dominated when it becomes about the graffiti breaking through to be something viewed in museums or sold for a lot of money. There's still a difference. Exactly. Another issue is how many of those people, not just being probably white and male, but also have they done quote unquote enough street time where it's actually from the culture of those the folks that have no other public space or have no resources to express in other ways or don't feel represented to have a voice. So aren't they sort of undermining the integrity of the act? Right, that becomes less street art and just art. It sort of divorces itself from where it's come from. The reception of graffiti is not the only thing that's been changing, however, but media uses it in its execution as well. Right, originally graffiti, the media, not the press, but the media used to actually make the marks has moved beyond permanent markers and paint. They've grown into stickers, sort of pre-made tags. You probably, if any modern city, usually I see those on crosswalks and the crossing lights and things like that. If you've noticed, right, where they're smaller in size and stickers, but you kind of see them more, right, than blending into the background. But also things like pre-made posters, which are otherwise known as wheat pastes. I'm assuming that's the type of paste, but that's affixed to walls, much like you'd see bills and actual advertisements on construction sites in urban areas, right? Usually see no bills post here, but then somebody does. But usually I feel like those are reputable main companies that we know. But apparently some graffiti artists use that medium to throw up a tag. I could see that being much faster, right? You like dip, throw the glue up there and you're done. You're not actually tagging. Which I'd be interested if that is seen in some way, because I do think there's that transgressive risk of being able to tag and get away with it. Right. I would think
might not be the same street credibility.
Yeah, exactly. I'm guessing. Okay, so trivia 3, and just round us out here. Graffiti artists successfully did this for the first time in the 1970s. A, tagged the Eiffel Tower. B, unionized. C, created indelible ink. D, sold graffiti for more than $1 million.
Eiffel Tower.
Unionized.
Oh, I thought it was going to be 3 for 3 this week.
I know. I wrote that one a bit hard, but just wanted to see, if unionized jumped out or not. But they did, in fact, unionize. And
I just thought that would be impossible since it isn't a paying job. So
right.
I'm
And that it was done
fascinated.
that earlier. I would have felt like unionized would have happened, yesterday, to be honest. Like, it seems like a very modern thing for graffiti. But yeah, apparently they unionized. And in response to that, I mentioned before, right, that it's difficult to kind of get through the is it sort of a glass ceiling? It's sort of just a ceiling to break into the upper echelons in museum culture. But in response to that type of unionization, they really clamped down and only decided to elevate a very select few in the space. So not as
sounds like the wrong use of a union, but okay.
Right. Well, the response to the union, I guess. Yeah, exactly. All right. So to close out before I finish up completely, I wanted to read one thing that actually did sort of piss me off. So it's a little different for me that usually I'm not presenting something like this, but I'll explain a bit why I just hate this way of looking at it. So I'm not a conservative in any way, audience. Anyone who's listened to previous.
I don't know. You're sounding a little conservative today, Mark.
Well, not conservative financially or in the need for societal communal networks and safety nets and infrastructures, but something like this pisses me off.
Okay.
And I'll explain why. Now I'm interested in what you think, Alison. Okay, so graffiti as praxis is an active encounter with the physical and material form of the city that attempts to make space social and public through the promotion of use values and meaningful acts of inhabitation versus the homogenizing practices of planning, and design, and commerce, and their overarching concern with surveillance, order, and security. That is, graffiti can be read as a means for reclaiming and remaking the city as a more humane social space by reflecting the meanings and values of those who inhabit and use the streets and public space of the city that counterbalance the dominating requirements of business.
Did a hipster doctoral student write that? I mean, absolutely. It was absolutely a hipster doctoral student. But okay.
So my biggest problem there is they polarize it. They pit this as this humanizing the space versus the requirements of business. And this is where I hate that business is held up as a negative thing that doesn't benefit anybody. What? Like, that's ridiculous. Business is not some cold, inhuman thing. It is created by people. It is run by people. It benefits people. Like, what? So, and I hardly think that you can say that the people, the few who are doing a transgressive act of going out and putting graffiti up, are representing the people of that neighborhood. Are you fucking kidding me? Like, that annoys the shit out of me.
You are making me laugh so hard. I think we would need an entire other episode, but I think they're probably saying business as a stand-in for capitalism, and we could discuss the evils of capitalism, which I do. I know you're much more of a capitalist than I am, but there are some inherent evils there, and I guess they're just giving a nod to there are a lot of people who live in major cities who don't benefit from the main businesses. Like, think of New York, banking being our main industry, right? And how many people don't benefit from that and are kind of unseen and unheard and all of that. But as an overarching, is it representing all the people? It certainly is not. So I'll give you that.
Is it making it a humane space reflecting the meanings and values of everyone that inhabits it? Because you have a big tag.
Well, not everyone,
on someone's
for sure.
Private
building.
No, I don't think so. But anyway, provocative thing to throw out there. I'm glad. No, I respect and of course love to hear your other side of it. Not really other side, but your take on it too. And I understand that if you're saying business meaning really broad capitalistic streaks, that we could certainly debate, and I would see value in some of that. But
you're not buying it. I know.
I'm not buying it. I actually end my notes with infuriating. Period. Meh. Anyway, so where I left off in my rabbit hole, I would love to take a deeper dive into that history of the pillars of hip hop and understand a little bit more. It's something so far from me, although I say that, and meanwhile, pop music has been so influenced by it. So to say that it's far from me is probably in itself an ignorant thing to say, because it can't be, because it's been everywhere in our music for so long. And the other thing was something we'll post in our notes is subway art. And I have a link to a Amazon link that it was just updated. It's a book that was updated in 2016, but it was originally published in 1984 and was sort of seen as a very breakthrough documentation of the NYC subway art scene. And they consider it an art scene. So that's by Cooper and Chalfant, who wrote that and then updated it in 2016. So I think that would be an interesting, retrospective. So Absolutely. That's it. My big questions, which I'll save for later.
I love it. I thank you for going down this avenue that I did not see coming. It was so interesting. And I'm glad you kind of ended, one of your 2 points was just about the hip hop culture from the 80s. So I was a huge fan of De La Soul and A Tribe Called Quest, late 80s, early 90s. And a lot of, when you said that, when you were talking about the art, I was thinking, oh yeah, a lot of their artwork on their albums and stuff was really graffiti influenced. But I never really thought of it as being a pillar. And now I'm certainly going to be listening to De La Soul tonight and Tribe when we get off this podcast. And I'll certainly put in our what to listen to some links for any of you who aren't familiar. Absolutely seminal hip hop music. But Mark, thank you. That was amazing.
Absolutely.
Okay. I went in a very different direction.
I can tell by your just the hits. I can't wait.
And maybe not very linear. So apologies in advance. I struggled with this one, quite honestly. And I think because, as we've mentioned a couple of times, the possibilities were so vast with an agentive noun. Did I get that right?
I think so.
Mark taught me something today. So I'm someone who loves books and reading. And any of you who watch the podcast instead of just listening can probably tell from my surroundings. It's a little dark today, but I have a giant bookcase behind me. That is my bookcase. I was really blessed. I was born to parents who loved reading and books, and they really instilled that in my brother and me from a very early age. They taught us to read before we were even in kindergarten. That's how important it was to them. And I was further blessed because my dad worked in publishing. So we always had access to free books, advanced reader copies and that sort of thing. He worked with libraries. So he was responsible for kind of like reviewing books for libraries. So a lot of books came his way. I must have been about 6 or so when I found out that outside of the library, most people had to pay for books. I was horrified. I was so upset that like these magical items weren't just available to everyone for free. Like, how could you make people pay for books? Absolutely. Like the first time the scales fell from my eyes, probably about anything in my life. So I was so excited when we got this word, but then I found it really hard. How am I going to tie this all together with like my love of it? But I found a quote from Carl Sagan when I was researching for this episode, which is really interesting since I wasn't expecting Carl Sagan, whom I've mentioned in other episodes, right, on other topics, to be relevant to this one. But there he was, perfectly summing things up. And I'm such a huge fan of his, so I was really happy. And here's the quote. "A book is made from a tree. It is an assemblage of flat, flexible parts, still called leaves, imprinted with dark pigmented squiggles. One glance at it and you hear the voice of another person, perhaps someone dead for thousands of years. Across the millennia, the author is speaking clearly and silently inside your head, directly to you. Writing is perhaps the greatest of human inventions, binding together people, citizens of distant epochs who never knew one another. Books break the shackles of time, proof that humans can work magic." And I thought that was so beautiful. He says this in an episode of Cosmos from the 80s called The Persistence of Memory. And I'll link that. I did find the video to actually watch. I think Sagan was probably inspired to this by Galileo, who actually once wrote, so all the way back, our very first episode, Orbit, Mark talked a lot about Galileo. Galileo once wrote, "What sublimity of mind was his who dreamed of finding means to communicate his deepest thoughts to any other person, though distant by mighty intervals of place and time." It's this idea of books connecting us through time and space. And when I came across it, I was just in awe, right? It so perfectly sums it up. We can time travel with books. They're magical. So as humans were evolving, as with any species, our genes held and conveyed the knowledge we needed for survival, our innate instincts. And then the brain started to develop from our primitive reptilian brain, which is still part of our brain, that part of our brain that has like the base kind of reactions of fear and anger and that sort of thing, like basic survival. We needed to hold,
I might butcher it. Yeah. The amygdala, thalamus.
I forget which one.
The base of the brain, the older part.
Yeah, exactly. It's right at the base. And then our more advanced brain kind of grew on top of it.
Medulla.
But it's still in there. But we needed to hold more information, right, as we developed. And because we needed more space for all of this survival knowledge. And Sagan talks about this. And then at some point, we needed writing, right? We needed to hold and convey even more information. Our oral tradition, language was developing, but our oral tradition just couldn't keep up. This eventually leads to writing and to libraries. So how did writing come to be? I was sure Mark was going to go down this path and talk about the history of writing. So as far as we've yet discovered, writing started with, I'm going to say cuneiform, but some people say cuneiform, but cuneiform. I've
only heard cuneiform, but yeah.
Yeah, me too. But then I saw videos where people saying cuneiform. So I looked it up and it seems to be a debate. But so cuneiform, which was developed in Mesopotamia about 3,400 BCE, basically etchings made onto bone or rock. And almost all of these were like recording events, like transactions, literally like trading grain, who traded what, or the, heroics of a king, it was very much recording things. And then in Egypt, about 200 years later, we see hieroglyphics developing. In China, we see writing by 1300 BC. And in Mesoamerica, we see writing systems appear by like 900 BCE. So like historians right now think writing kind of developed 4 different places, right? Four separate places that happened. And then this, of course, spreads. And by the mid 1400s, Johannes Gutenberg creates arguably the most important invention in history, the printing press. So movable type. Now, interestingly, movable type was actually invented in China, of course, around 1040, but it was porcelain. But Johannes Gutenberg creates the printing press, a mechanical device that can print out multiple pieces of the same thing. So before this, anything written, books and manuscripts, was of course done by hand. And then were hand copied in Western world, at least, often by monks who would hand copy manuscripts to preserve them over and over again, which created a lot of mistakes. So you can actually track when manuscripts have survived, how things have changed. And these were, of course, there were so few of them, they're only available to a few elite. But after the printing press, books and learning were available to anyone who could read. So this amazing development that suddenly, if you could read, the masses could start to be educated. And this, of course, leads to the immense importance of writers. Somebody had to be writing things for all of this to spread. So scholars and artists who documented their thoughts and their ideas and their fantasies that others in their time and beyond, as Sagan points out, could read and learn from and build on and build from. And what I mean by that is written material allows human species to gain knowledge that helps them create material things, like literally build from. And Mark, you mentioned in one of our earlier episodes, I think it was your big question, like what happens if the world is some huge natural disaster and libraries are destroyed? How do we know how to build a water wheel? Like, how do we know how to build the things that none of us know how to do anymore? So, writers write that down and give us that, but it also just helps people sort of new imaginary places and make new connections that lead to new inventions and connections that lead to a drawing together of humanity. And I know this sounds super like airy fairy, namby-pamby, blah, 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 but it really is like this resounding message that we are all connected. And James Baldwin has an amazing quote. He once said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive." And the importance of that. So besides being able to build a water wheel, to realize in this more like humanistic level how connected we are, I think is just of unparalleled importance. And Kurt Vonnegut, who's one of my favorite writers in the world, has said, "I believe that reading and writing are the most nourishing forms of meditation anyone has so far found. By reading the writings of the most interesting minds in history, we meditate with our own minds and theirs as well. And this to me is a miracle." So the words of others, they educate, they soothe, they enlighten, they uplift. And like I said, it's not just this ethereal feel-good stuff here. It's, writers throughout history have also been at the heart of rebellions. Many of the leaders of the 1916, Easter Rising in Ireland against British rule were writers and poets. Like I think the majority of the leaders, in fact. Gabriel García Márquez, who is a Colombian writer, was a Colombian writer. He started his career as a journalist, and then he became a renowned novelist. And many of his topics focus on the corruption of previous Colombian regimes. And he was an activist. He actively negotiated for hostage release, and this activism was tied to his writing, and he used his voice to educate others and to get others to join his cause. And of course, speaking of journalists, even today, there are many all over the world who risk their lives daily to bring news to people in defiance of dictatorial governments. One example from recent years, of course, is Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by the Saudi government. So this is my love letter. This is my love letter to the writers of the world, past, present, and future. Just thank you for your words and your ideas and your inspiration and your comfort. And thank you for creating worlds that shy or lonely or abused children can escape into. And thank you for saying what so many of us think or feel, but can't adequately express. And thank you especially to all of those standing on the front lines. Thank you to all of these writers creating an unbroken line throughout time, allowing us the magic of time travel. And that is my short and sweet love letter to writers.
I love it. It's beautiful and poetic that you have written, right? Something that therefore that itself lives on, right? To your point, the fact that you will find that in a drawer or on your computer in another 20 years, or the fact that then that, just to really go down the rabbit hole with it, we know that we transcribe our own episode. So although we're speaking, and this is a visual thing right now, right? In another few days, we will have another written print, so to speak, a duplication of what you just said, right? So it propagates itself, which I think is amazing. Thank you for that, Alison. That's great.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy that, to contrast the direction I went, you gave us that history of the writer. We sort of switched places in a little bit of a way, actually, this week, now that I think about it. Excellent.
All right. Nice. Hit me with a big question, Mark.
Yeah. And it's funny. I was just sort of, I scribbled one down, a second big question in response to yours. So I love it when your rabbit hole makes me think of a new question that I didn't have coming into this week. So that's great. So if our society afforded each individual a means to feel seen, to feel heard, and to feel a sense of accomplishment, industry, and praise, would graffiti never have existed?
That is a good question.
Right. The second, epilogue to that. Or will there always be a human rebellion against communal order and the dominance of a rule of law?
Yeah, I kind of feel like that, like the latter. There will always be this need. And I think there are probably multiple drivers behind graffiti. You talked about different pieces of the kind of story of graffiti, but you have people who just need an outlet. You have people who want to express themselves artistically, and this is how they do it because they don't have supplies to do it any other way. They're not going to art school, that sort of thing. You have people who do it because it is a statement. It is saying, I'm going to make a mark here in this city that is cold and, uncaring, and I don't feel like, cares about me at all. So I do think probably just with the history of humans wanting to leave their mark, going back to the cave paintings like you talked about, my guess is it would probably still exist. But what do you think?
I'm torn. I'm proud of the question, I think, because I don't 100% know. I think most of me wants to react to it the way that I reacted to your story during our slab episode, where I considered that civilization, right? That group that sprung up, that way of living, to be representative of a failing of society. So I think I do think it would be greatly reduced and unnecessary, because here's where, as opposed to that drive in the past that you mentioned of leaving a mark on something, that may have been leaving a mark in a public, in an unowned space, a rock in the woods, a cave that person was living in. That is different than I think nowadays, because I think what I do is I put myself in that split second. Well, they have to plan and go buy things, and there's not a split second, but where they walk up, there is a split second. Sorry, audience, going back and forth, but there is that moment where they're about to go up. There's no one around. They're not going to get caught. They're able to tag, and they make the decision to reach out and touch property that is not theirs. It is owned by someone. Often it can be a private building that's owned. I think maybe sometimes they choose things that are public, right? Or if it's very discursive, if it's very targeted towards government, things like that. And then they deface it. And so that's where I feel like if they were nurtured in other ways to respect that someone else, that is someone else's thing, that's someone else's property, just because you have a need to express, find healthier ways to do it. And I think that's where society has let them down, to not respect the other person's property. But
it might be a conscious choice to say, the 1% have all of this. I want to white on somebody else's, not because I haven't been quote unquote taught better. It's because I'm trying to make a point, which I know you also don't support. I'm just throwing out there that it's not all about society failing them in the way you're talking about.
But no, I'm glad you're challenging it. Well, that's where I feel like if they feel seen and heard, like I think it's a broader, I mean, we're not going to solve it. That's the nature of our big questions. But yeah, if they're seen, heard, more integrated into society, certainly less of the 1%. I think if other things are working as we would want an idealized society to, I think they would not need to define themselves in this very shallow aesthetic way. I do see it as that way, right? Like something that means a bit more to them, that isn't as ephemeral, that won't get washed off, that is respectful of the community around them. That's where I struggle. But anyway, big question for everyone to think about. And then we don't need to dig into it in the interest of time, but in response to yours, right? You mentioned the writers throughout history were often those on the front lines of civil movements that left a mark and really changed things. And you mentioned Ireland, but in many cultures throughout history. So I feel like in the conglomeration and the consolidation of artists and writers behind things like big music labels, big publishing houses, where there's less and less for the ability for an independent writer to really have a voice and a following, are we there for a society really losing the disruptive and rebellious voices because of you needing to conform to the career of writing and therefore be represented by a larger organization, is therefore there less of that commentary and less of that ability to be a gadfly and like a rogue influence.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think probably, yes, given the rise of something else you talked about, which so much now is like visual social media videos, like what we see, people get more news from that than reading. And so.
Oh, yeah. I wasn't even thinking, of just the
I don't think it negates it, but
volume
I think
of it is less. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting and terrifying.
Sorry, I cheated and did 2. So by all means.
No, that's good. I actually have 2 as well. And I feel like my piece was really short. So I think I thought I could do 2. But my first one is very small and quick and less serious. And then my second one's more serious. So the first one, it's like definitely for you, Mark. Like I want your opinion on this.
Okay.
So one of the types of writers I didn't talk about were entertainment writers. So people who write screenplays, for instance, right? People who write plays, people who write movies. There's an argument to be made that they're much more important than the actors. that they're much more talented than the actors. Now, I'm not saying that actors aren't important and that we don't have many very talented actors, but without the writing, without the power, without like a Tom Stoppard, say, right, a playwright that both Mark and I like, could you argue that the writer is actually more of the superstar when it comes to a really powerful or important artistic piece than the actors? And Mark, having been both an actor and a playwright, I'm interested in your perspective. I think probably the answer is they're both important, but I just wanted to see what you would say there.
They are both important, I think, in the way that obviously not an easy question. And this is me loving you for asking that because it's a really good question. Equally important, the way things have evolved, I think, in our culture now and our history. Yes, I would say the writer is more important to the creation of the piece existing. Like it wouldn't exist if someone didn't write it, if someone didn't delve into the dramatic question, the conflict. There has to be an engine of a big question, right? With this section, right? There is usually a big question being battled out, and that writer has dedicated blood, sweat, and tears to making that work, to exploring that question. To your point, though, yeah, you need really talented people to have that be successful. You can have really great work, but have a terrible performance, and therefore that work doesn't propagate. It doesn't move on and get a following, at least nowadays, because people aren't reading plays. If people read more plays, then I think those writers would be much higher in esteem, right? Because really the only way they're experiencing it is through performance, which I think in the past was less so. I think you had more people actually reading a play because you couldn't go see them as much, probably. Right.
Interesting.
So yeah, I would vote that because of that. If things had continued the way maybe they were in the past, where actors were in troupes who composed, often told things that weren't written down, the actors were telling stories or retelling stories, then you almost didn't have that question because they were fused.
Right.
Yeah, I don't even know why I'm sharing that, because it's not relevant, because they did split, and you still have actor writers, but it's less so, right? And they're not usually, sometimes completely giving you an improvised full story, from
right.
start.
Well,
sorry, that's convoluted answer, but I love it.
No, it's not. I loved it because, again, I don't think there's any answer, but I had this as my big question already. And then a couple of days ago, I was listening to Fresh Air, which is a program on NPR, Terry Gross. And it wasn't her, it was one of her colleagues interviewing F. Murray, the actor F. Murray Abraham. So he's currently has a role in the second season of White Lotus, if anyone watches that. I haven't seen it, but he also
was just nominated for Emmy, I think.
Oh, was he for that?
I think so, yeah, because he was in the news and stuff for... Anyway, can finish your thought and we'll talk about him.
Well, he also, back in the day, he played Salieri in the movie Amadeus.
And
he won an Academy Award for that. And at some point, the interviewer brought that up. And I'm not sure of all the details. I'll link this episode of Fresh Air on the website and in the notes. But he talked about winning that award. And that was also a stage play at some point. Mm-hmm. And he noted that any actor who's played Salieri has won like some sort of award. And he was saying, I think that's a tribute to the writing more than to me or to any of these actors, all of whom were fine actors. And it's funny because I'd already written this question and I was like, oh my God, he just like gave me this example.
That is wonderful. Yeah. Amadeus is an amazing play. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, here's my second thing. And part of this is my entire thing was originally going to be about this brief little blurb I'm going to tell you about, and then I have a question. It's a much more serious thing. And then I was like, it's just not enough. But there is a book, of course, we'll link it, called The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, which I highly, highly recommend. And
that title's amazing.
Very, very quick synopsis. So Timbuktu in Mali was the center of Islamic culture and scholarship in the 13th to 16th centuries, common era. I always get that confused.
I don't remember. Common
era. And so in more recent times, Timbuktu really became the center of the manuscript trade for all of these ancient manuscripts, any of them that still existed. And it was a place where scholars would preserve and restore hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from this time. And in 2012, I think, militant Islamists backed by Al-Qaeda arrive in Mali, start to threaten everything cultural. We've seen plenty of examples of this in other areas. And one of these things being threatened were these manuscripts, because most of the manuscripts are really evidence of how a secular and religious blend of Islam was beautifully practiced in this region for hundreds of years. So something Al-Qaeda wanted to destroy, to kind of say, no, like the strict religious route is the only way. So there's one man named Abdel Kadir Hadara. He smuggled over 350,000 medieval manuscripts to safety. So he had already been working on gathering these, and the book goes into great detail, and it's fascinating on this. He would go out. A lot of these manuscripts were owned by families. They were buried in like backyards for safekeeping. He was gathering them and creating a library for all of these. So there'd be a place where people could go and study these and see these, and they could be restored and protected. And then in comes the militant Islamists, and he realizes these are going to be destroyed. They're going to loot, they're going to raid, they're going to burn. They have to get out of Timbuktu. And so he undertakes, with a lot of help, a mission to move all of these manuscripts out, packs them into trunks. They're smuggled out in donkey carts. They're, crates of them are put on ships under tarps, and all like kind of under the nose of the militant Islamists. And it's like in the dead of night. And almost all of these have now made it to Bamako and are safe. And it is just this really beautiful, like heroic effort to save manuscripts, to save these writings.
You may not know this based on your research of it, but I'm dying to know, like, for me, it would have been, yes, you want to maintain the actual physical pieces, sure. But it felt like the most pressing thing is to document what they say. Like, I'm surprised maybe it was. The first push to me would have been like, unroll them all, snap a digital pic, upload it to the cloud, right? Like just save it so we have it. But I wonder.
Yeah.
Just
and I don't know. No, that's actually a really good point. There's the whole story of what he did before and after, in terms of gathering them and just trying to preserve them and then having to get them out and save them. There's this one story that makes me tear up every time. Like I said, he needed a lot of help from people, and a lot of locals in Mali feel like great pride that these manuscripts, is like incredible scholarly works existed there, came from there, and were preserved. So people were generally willing to help, often putting their own lives in danger to protect these books. And there's one story of an elderly man who kind of was posted on the road to watch for the Islamists coming and to be lookout. And he had a couple very close calls, and he did survive this, but he was illiterate. He couldn't even read, and he was willing to put his life on the line because he understood that there was this importance to like maintaining this for humanity. You could see him like tearing up thinking about this because I think it's so beautiful. But I guess my big question is like, is preserving these physical things, which I didn't even think of it that way, Mark, but the way you just said it, is it worth putting someone's life in danger to do that for something like maintaining this knowledge? Again, unanswerable question, but I did want to share the story, and I did want to kind of get your perspective where we should be drawing the line about putting people's lives in danger, which it was his choice, to be clear.
I was just going to start with, it's a choice, like to force it on someone. No, I think that would be wrong. But if someone felt so compelled to balance their own life versus the benefit of that knowledge existing for a generation, for potentially infinite number of humans to see it in the future, I mean, that's a beautiful thing. I can see why it's emotional. And for me, I could see that being important just to make sure that the knowledge was preserved, I guess, in my opinion. Maybe somebody would feel the same for just the physical pieces, but I feel like if somebody had to choose, am I going to die to be able to, I'm picturing like someone's raiding a location, they might burn it, kill them, seize them, and destroy the physical pieces. If someone was willing to risk their life just to snap the pictures and upload it, right, through probably a very weak internet signal or something, wherever these things are out in the countryside, being buried, and you said backyards and things. How dramatic is that, right? Just to keep the importance of the ideas there. It's sort of related when you were talking before about the history of writing, right? There are many ways to look at to think that we didn't necessarily, this is a weird way of looking at it, but I think it's why the true meaning of memes, of ideas acting like genes and finding a way to propagate themselves. You could almost be like, did we decide we needed writing, or did the ideas need a vehicle to sustain themselves? And that's right.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
It's like they found a way through us to propagate. And
you had a big question like that in one episode about like, are we just agents of ideas that are
right? That's right.
They need to be kept alive, so they're using us or something. You had something really interesting like that.
Right. But what gets trippy about that is they don't exist without us. Right. So it's like, but they do become this weird connective tissue of conscious, like of ideas. Right. It's very, it's weird. I love that. Now I answered that, but what is your thought on that? I'm sensing you are like, yes, it is worth it, of course, but I don't know.
I think it's too hard to answer. I think what you said, I think it's a personal choice. And obviously that man decided it was worth it. And I just think it's so beautiful because he couldn't even read, right? So it was the philosophy of it. It was this idea that he understood that was important. And was willing to risk his life for it and to stand up for something he believed in. So of course I believe in standing up for what you believe in, even if your life is in danger.
Yeah. I really want to find out. I mean, they must have been scanned. The knowledge must be saved somewhere.
I will research that just for you.
Thank you.
Okay. So should we talk about where we came out rating wise?
Oh yeah. Let's do that.
So you were at an 8.
I was at an 8. I really did go high. I'm going to drop down to a 5.
Entering it.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed digging into it. I enjoyed that there was a surprising, very different angle that came about from looking at the Oxford English Dictionary and not realizing that they were considered writers. Like that's the term. And as a side note, if anyone's wondering, a bit of why, I think it's largely comes from the first tags were often words, right? The stylized, at least that's what I think of when I really think of graffiti, right? Is usually the stylized calligraphy of a name or a permutation of a name that someone's tagged. So they were writing text, which I think was one of the reasons why they were called a writer instead of like a painter or something like that.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I was at a 7, so very close to you. I'm also going down to a 5. Okay. I loved, I was so excited about the word, and I'm so excited about books, obviously, but I struggled hard with this one. I must have rewritten this like 3 or 4 times. I was telling Mark, I came out to a place I wasn't even trying to write a love letter. Like I honestly was trying to go down very different directions. And
I have to ask, what sort of was each time you restarted, what was the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak? Like what made you say, no, I'm going to start again?
Well, I started with the Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, which I had read a number of years ago and thought, this is it. This is such an amazing story. And when I actually reread it and then went, it's such a great story, but it's not as focused on writers, right? It's on preserving the writing. Like I don't know how to get the writer part in there because we don't know a lot about the actual original writers. A lot of them were anonymous. So it just didn't quite fit. And I thought, but I'll still work it in and I'll talk about like acts of like that old man standing up for himself. What else? And then I thought about, okay, let's talk about let me tell stories about the Easter Rising in 1916 and Pierce and like just so many of the men who led that and were executed for it, how they were writers and poets and journalists. And then I thought, okay, I'll talk about Gabriel, García, Márquez. I'll talk about multiple people. And then I thought, well, the through line doesn't tie together enough. It's going to be like going in too many directions. So then I took a step back to go, let's look at the history of writing really and see how writing kind of brings us like through history and how it developed. And then we get to the printing press, which I do argue is the most important invention we've ever had. But it just seemed a little too dry. And then I found the Sagan quote and I was like, this is it. This is it for me. This is the importance of writing. This is the importance of giving people written things on all these levels. And then I could tie in the piece of writing, and then I threw in right. So then all these other pieces came together, and it just became this like love letter to how much I appreciate that there are writers in the world that make such a difference in how we think and how we feel. The James Baldwin quote, like you might think you're the only person in the world who thinks something, and then you read it and read someone else's words and go, oh, someone else just understood me so perfectly. And that's priceless. So that was my very long meandering way. So I'm going to go down to a 5 just because it was so difficult for me, but I still enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy the process so much, but I enjoyed where I came out and everything I learned.
I love that you mentioned that part of how to experience and have move beyond a sympathy to an actual empathy, because you're experiencing what that other person was feeling. I think until we actually have some way to share someone else's physical, emotional sense, writing is the closest you can get to being in someone else's shoes, to being in their mind. So yeah, that makes sense. Love it. All right. Should I give us our word for next time?
Our noun, you shall.
All right, everybody. And rehearsal.
I'm laughing as we were just talking about writers.
I know. And yeah. and performance and acting and my background.
Oh yeah. With your background, this is going to be interesting. Rehearsal. Okay. I'm going to give this, I'm going to go straight down the middle. I'm going to go with a 5 because I'm just not sure if it's like too similar or if I'm going to find some fascinating new through line.
All right.
What about you?
6. Let's go with the 6.
Okay.
I'm not quite split down the middle. I'm intrigued by, I think I feel like a challenge to not play the obvious based on my background, to see if there's some other thread there for me to pick up.
Play the obvious. I like that.
Oh,
a little fun.
Boom.
What?
Follow the same old script.
Oh, ouch. Okay. It's definitely time to read us out.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you everyone very much. This has been another episode of the ReNouned podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please follow us and subscribe on whatever platform you are currently watching or listening to us on. You can usually follow and subscribe to it. Also, rating us officially on the platforms helps us quite a bit to gather some momentum for the show and reach a wider audience. We also invite you to please visit us on the web at renownedpodcast.com or on social media at ReNouned Podcast. And of course, tune in next week for a new episode and a new noun, either next week or the week after.
Yeah. And I just want to quickly add, again, Happy New Year to everyone. And thank you for your patience as we went through our little hiatus, but we are back on board and we're really excited to bring you new episodes on a regular basis in 2023.
See you soon.